Hello.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining this week's webinar. So this week is part three of the Reframe BI Analytics webinar series, and this is focusing on BI governance. So the title of the presentation is Reframe Governance for Better BI Outcomes. Like I say, then today's presentation is brought to you by Reframe. So that's the data consultancy that myself and Megan both work at. It's a UK-based data consultancy that looks at the sort of end-to-end processing of data, focusing on data engineering, data architecture, BI analytics, and provides a range of services in those areas. I'll give a bit of an introduction to myself. So I'm Colin. I've got a career spanning 15 years in data analytics projects, ranging from sort of permanent roles within financial services and utilities companies, and more recently sort of in consultancy, looking at a range of different clients and trying to help them use data to improve their processes and solve business problems. Megan, would you like to say hi?
Sure. So yeah, I'm Megan Lividas, co-head of BI and Analytics at Reframe. And I always joke that while at Reframe we are technology agnostic, I'm a bit more biased. My experience is firmly in the kind of Power BI world and more recently Fabric. You'll hear me talking a lot about Power BI enablement. So today's a really fun webinar for me because this is really my wheelhouse of late. I've been doing end-to-end Power BI implementations across various industries for the last 6 years, from insurance to retail and kind of everything in between. But yeah, a lot of chat about how do we actually get the most out of that work? How do we make sure we see the ROI? And how do we govern a BI tool? So yeah, I guess from there, Colin, you want to talk us through where we've been?
Yeah, so as I've mentioned earlier on in the conversation, this is week 3 of 4. So the plan has been to curate 4 different webinars around BI and analytics and companies' relationships and journeys through them and where we see the biggest pain points. So week 1 was all around implementing the right BI tool. That was a couple of weeks ago now. Last week, we talked about optimizing existing BI tools for peak performance. This week, we have governance and how that drives better outcomes for your business and your users. And next week, we're going to be talking about navigating BI migration. So once you've got a tool and you think it's the right time to move to a new tool, how do you do that effectively and make sure that you're not falling into any of the classic pitfalls? So for the sessions that we ran previously, if you weren't able to attend, then if you reach out to either myself or Megan or Deframe, then we can make sure that you can get the recording of those. If you're not yet subscribed or registered for next week's one and you think that's something that's going to be interesting to you, then please follow the links that you've used to kind of get registered for that. And yeah, just touching on last week's session in a little bit more detail. So we talked about optimizing your BI platform, where we looked at sort of 5 key areas where you can really make a difference to your performance. So that we're looking at model design, how you import data into your BI platform, making sure that you're using the right types of calculations to make sure that the data being processed as effectively as possible, how you can actually design the layout of your dashboards to make an impact performance difference. So how that's changed and evolved, the thinking around that has changed quite drastically over the last few years. And then finally, once you've done all that optimization, if you still come up against difficulties, how you then look at capacity tuning or maybe even increasing your capacity to make sure that that's the right resources to meet your business needs.
Right. So reframing governance for better BI outcomes. And so this is where we'll kick off. And I think I just want to start by saying, um, often questions have been asked. I think actually a question was asked in one of the last webinars. Why BI governance? Data governance. Sometimes we have whole functions that look after data governance. What makes it any different for BI? And I think the answer to that really is that BI tools are often just left so unmanaged and the ownership not clearly defined that it can just feel something that just runs away in its own right. I think a certain level of technical expertise of the tool is also required to really be able to govern it. And it's just one of those things, it's the front end. It's the front end of all of that hard work that we put into in a data function. We want to make sure that people are getting the most out of it. And so in my experience, a dedicated attention on BI governance specifically is really going to be what's going to help you get the best outcome for all of that hard work that you're doing. So I want to start off by talking about how we balance controls and innovation. Often we see this scenario in which organizations sort of stifle any sort of creativity by just putting far too many controls in place. I'm sure anyone in a kind of BI world has had a role where you're not allowed to do this and you're not allowed to do that and you've got to do this request and it's just no fun, nothing gets done. But the alternative to that is a kind of free-for-all with very little control. And so finding the right bit of the spectrum to operate on can be a challenge. Um, what I often talk about is these organizations where you have self-service functionality, your users are happy, but there is no governance. And these are your organizations that are the free for all. We've all worked somewhere that looks a bit like this. There are multiple versions of the truth. People from different teams are turning up and talking about number is good. What are you talking about? Number is bad. They're both talking about the same number. They've got it from completely different places. And this is where an ungoverned self-service world, even if the users are quite happy, can be quite an issue. And you just have so much duplication, same versions of the report living in different places and very siloed insight. What typically then happens is someone will come in and implement a lot of controls. We put that governance in place. Often this then actually stifles, and so we'll move around this diagram to be in a world where we have self-service functionality, it's well governed, but our users aren't happy. And this is often one of two things. Either the controls we put in place are just so stifling that nobody can get anything done. Sometimes, though, it is actually a training issue. People don't realise the world of self-service that you've enabled for them and how they can get the most out of that. And so really taking the time to understand, is it a blocker I've created or do the users just not get it yet? If they need more support, more hands-on guidance through, it's very easy to assume that just things like drilling up and down can be understood when actually it requires quite a bit of attention to take your users through that. Now, we're talking about self-service here, and you could be asking, do I need self-service? Can I not just have happy users and everything's well governed and I give them what they want? Of course you can. Not all organizations need a self-service functionality. I think that to make this work, you need a superstar BI team who are very quick. And the key to that can be proactive business partnering. Really, you don't want to build a backlog up in a team like this. You need to be proactively working out what your people need before they're coming to you to ask for it. And in this sort of organization, yeah, absolutely, you can have your governance in place and very happy users, and you don't need to implement that self-service functionality. But often that is what we need. We see a big trend in federated data models where people in the business have the right to create their own reporting, to explore their own insights. And so the sweet spot in the middle that we're aiming for is happy and engaged users who have self-service functionality, but it is well governed. So from there, I guess you can be asking, well, how do we get to that? And this is where our 3 pillars of Power BI governance come in. So I would look at this as essentially your roadmap. This is your shopping list. This is where you sit down, you assess your organisation across these areas, and this will then start to build out, well, we know this is an issue. We've done a little bit better there, and this can build out essentially your roadmap. And so I'll kind of pull some of these up, but then we're going to get into a bit more detail in the next few slides about really what you need to take into account in those areas. So people, and I start with people because I think when I talk about BI governance, everyone assumes that I'm going to be saying workspaces and tenant settings and capacity management. No, of course that's important, but we always take a people first approach because none of those processes and none of that tech means anything if your people don't understand where they fit into the process. Of course, we then have the meat and the bones of it. How do we administer our platform and how do we set it up and how do we maintain it? And lastly, what technology we augment that process with. So what development standards do we set? How do we manage change and how do we monitor? And so we'll get into a bit more detail there, but yeah, I don't know, Colin, any thoughts?
Yeah, so I think very much when we look at particularly that last slide, that Venn diagram, depending on what your organization looks like will very much depend then what's the right interventions to make for you. So I think the degree to which you might need self-service or the degree to which your business users are already engaged in data will very much then steer what sort of the governance interventions you might need to make are. I think your business users are fundamentally want to be in a situation where they know where to find the right data for the analysis they want to provide. They want to be able to have confidence in that data so that they can service it to their stakeholders, knowing that they're not going to get embroiled in those conversations about which number's right, which number's wrong. So really all of this stuff should be seen through a lens of empowering your business users to want to use that data because they know that it's going to help them do their role.
Yeah, absolutely. And you'll see me talk a lot more about the theory of Power BI governance and self-service in other talks. So at Data Scotland and at SQL Bits. I think the SQL Bits recording is actually on YouTube. And we talk about the self-service pyramid and how far you can go with self-service. How much control do you want to relinquish as a data team versus how much freedom you give your business users and what the trade-off is there. So let's get a bit more into the people side of this. So when I talk people, I'm talking roles, I'm talking training, I'm talking community engagement. So I think the first things first, and this is something that often happens quite organically. I don't think very often an organisation sits down and really decides the BI roles in a team. They might decide, right, we're going to have this many developers and so on, but there's often, I think, a gap in defining who owns the tool, who is the BI admin, who's responsible for checking latest updates, for maintaining the settings, and for managing the actual overall health of the platform. I think then setting expectations for developers versus power users. So who sits in a business and is going to have a certain amount of control and ability to use a tool versus who actually is that central team. And making sure that your licensing complements that strategy is really important. But from there, once you have that sort of role defined, right from, who is my consumers and what do I expect of them? Who are my stakeholders that really are my sponsor of the tool? Once you have that defined, all the processes design and revolve around those people. Now, I think in a BI world, you'll see one of two things. Either people are very sort of engaged in the kind of BI community and take it on themselves to do training. But I think in a lot more traditional organisations, you don't really see that investment in the training of BI people because it's very often something that we just teach ourselves. Very few of us go to BI school. A lot of us are just thrown a license and we figure it out. We're self-taught. And so you often see these very self-taught teams who they might see a bit of a blog post on LinkedIn and hear a bit of something here, but often these habits are picked up or you've just not had that scale to operate at that really lets you figure it out. And so I would urge any organisation that really wants to take BI seriously to have a training path for their internal teams. And this doesn't need to be expensive. Microsoft Learn has some really great material out there. So I would encourage everyone, if you do Power BI, work through Microsoft Learn. Same for Tableau, there's some fantastic content out there. YouTube can be great. And so as an organisation, honing in a training path, augmenting this with in-person training from experts can be great. I love getting to come to a client and do training, whether that be consumer training to make sure people know how to actually get the most out of it, right through to advanced modelling. We go right under the iceberg of Power BI and talk about auto-exist and cross-filter direction and how to get the most out of all of that. Where this then comes to life is having a thriving community. So whether this is a Teams channel, whether it's a sort of Confluence world, whatever your tool of choice is, having a platform where people all over the business, no matter what their interest or experience, can come to talk about BI is so crucial. I've seen this work really well at organisations where they have monthly calls. So there's a monthly call, people come and there's always a demo. So people from all over the business will bring things to the table. This is what we've worked on. This is the value we're seeing from it. And that can just be so great for fostering that collaboration that you want to see across a BI organisation. I think being able to then have a sort of central knowledge hub where people are able to share materials and your central team that foster that community, we would share 101 guides. So Workspaces 101, Gateways 101, and that effectively informs your onboarding guide. Anyone that is new to your tool can benefit from this whole suite of information that you've been developing over time and reacting to the requests of your community.
So I think, Megan, if I can just jump in. So I think when we're looking at these three categories here, my reflections on this are sort of your roles and your training are something that can be done almost like a project or a deployment, and you can get either people in or you can work through it yourself. I think that community engagement piece is the bit that if you do it well means that the value from those first two pieces gets extended and becomes sort of the longevity of that implementation, the value received is kind of all underpinned by that community engagement piece and having people within your organization who are enthused by the technology, who are keeping up to date with the latest releases and features that are within your tool. And then that starts just kind of paying for itself over and over. So yeah, I think that's something that you don't often see done particularly well in big organizations, but where it is done well, then you can really see the benefit of it.
Yep, absolutely. And so then we talk process. So this is a bit more of the meat and the bones. And, we're honing in on Power BI here, but there are 5 sort of key examples of areas of process to examine. So the first is going to be workspaces. So I know that can something people take for granted, but I've seen organizations where they have far too many workspaces. That's probably the most common, where each use case, each report is managed at a workspace level. And then I've seen other organizations where they have one workspace and everything is thrown in there. Sometimes you see a lot of overuse of personal workspaces, which is also not great. And so taking that time to really define, do I want to have a use case driven workspace approach? Do I want to have a function driven workspace approach? And how am I going to share that data? Do my models and my reports have to live in different places? Never mind thinking about environments. It's very common to see no development or test workspaces and everything goes to production. Sometimes we see development and test and QA and parallel production, and you think there's no way that this is flowing through all 5 of these environments. There's sporadic use of them all, and it's overcomplicated. Maybe some real experts have come in, they've set all this up and used it, but when they leave, is that actually realistic for people to use? Of course not. So it can be about rationalizing down and making sure that we streamline the process, and sometimes it can be about expanding it out. That really is going to be unique to every business. Access management. I mean, there are so many ways to manage access in Power BI. We can have workspace roles. We can do direct access. We can share links, which always terrify me because the default is that it shares with everyone in the organization. We can turn that off in the tenant settings, but if that's not getting much attention, yeah, you create a link, happens sometimes without even really intentionally doing it. You just go share, great, here's a link, and off I send it. Now, anyone who gets that link is seeing your report, and you've lost all control of that. You can even see things like publishing to the web, people wanting to embed, and this is very common. I'd say my personal preference with Access is always app audiences. I think being able to manage hubs of content, it's a bit more granular than managing at a workspace level, but not as granular as managing at an asset level. But the real answer is that there is no right answer when it comes to access. I think when it comes to workspace and access here, I always remember one client saying to me, Microsoft will give you 1,000 ways to do something. They don't tell you the one right way to do it. And the answer, there is no one right way. There is a reason that they've delivered those features, and it's because Microsoft want to enable everyone, no matter how big or small your organization is. So it's really about drowning out the noise of everyone's opinions about the one right way to do it, and just consider what the right way is for your organization. Now, security, a bit more straightforward, I'd say, when it comes to security, in terms of just making sure that you have, if row level security is required, object level security comes up often, having this managed in the most automated way possible with the least amount of overhead. Gateways, again, can feel like a bit of a minefield. I think what we often see is people know, right, I've got a SharePoint file here, I've got an on-premises SQL server, a gateway is spun up and it's under my name, but at least it's working. All of a sudden that person leaves, and what we're left with is a whole suite of reporting that nobody can refresh the connections to. So then we start talking about VNet gateways. This feels like a whole black box that some people kind of don't want to understand. Understanding not just what kinds of gateways you need, but how to manage them, how to monitor them is a crucial part of this that can feel quite intimidating, I think, for a lot of people. And lastly, tenant settings. I can't talk enough about tenant settings, to be honest, just in terms of how much you can customize your Power BI experience. I think we joke about things like publish to web and say, oh, well, who would leave that turned on? But it does happen. And I think where this happens easily is that roles are not defined, coming back to who owns your platform. BI tools are very often something that just gets switched on. We don't have whole project teams deciding how we roll it out. Power BI specifically often comes with your E5 licensing. And so then it just happens over time and nobody takes that ownership of it. So really being able to grasp who owns the tenant settings, who is going to check each month which releases have happened. In a Fabric world, we have new tenant settings every month and they can be critical, like Fabric. Fabric is now generally available. Do we want to benefit from Fabric as an organization? I would say the answer is, absolutely yes. Do we want to benefit from Copilot? Absolutely yes. But having that conversation and that dialogue is so critical. So yeah, that's the process side. I don't know, Colin, is there anything you want to add there?
Yeah, so I actually had a question come in on this. So the slide here is making references to Power BI. Would these processes be applicable to other BI tools? And yeah, the answer is yes. I think the fundamentals of these processes here are where and how are you going to store the data or your assets within your platform? How are you going to access that information and secure it? How are you then going to transfer that data or ingest and transfer that data around from your various platforms within the business? And then what functionality do your users have, and what's their ability to be able to move that data and share that with other people within the organization, and how are they going to do that? So for each different technology, the titles and the headings will be slightly different, and what we call a workspace, it might actually just be a folder within Tableau or whatever. But yeah, the principles are all the same. That those considerations need to be made when you're using any BI tool.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we'll talk a bit more about this maybe next week when we talk migrations. See, let's say we're going from Tableau to Power BI, and we'll see lots of Tableau folders and projects, and there's a desire to sort of like for like it. But moving from one tool to the other, you want to manage this a bit different. But absolutely, principles are the same. You just tweak the headings and go from there. So, lastly, what technology do we implement to complement all of this sort of people work that we've invested in and the processes we've put around them? We start with development standards. I think this can often be as consultants where we come in, and we talked a lot about this last week when we talked about optimization. But what does best practice look like? Where do I transform my data? Where do I manage my calculations? What does tactical development look like versus strategic development? And getting a right balance of that. Again, coming back to where is that line between controls and innovation? It's very easy to say best practice, don't ever add this and don't ever do that. Everything's upstream. But sometimes it's just not going to work like that. You need to get what you need out the door to make your users happy. And that's okay. There's absolutely ways that you can have tactical development to get people what they need, to help them figure it out. And then you shift that upstream at a later date. Deployment pipelines. This is where we talk about managing change. Managing change in Power BI, for example, it's just so critical. We still, to this day, I think, see people going straight into production with very little version control. And so what we'll see is, model final new, model 2024, model FY24, model 2.0, and it's just textbook. And as a new person kind of landing in an organization, it could just be so intimidating. And it's because usually there's just a hesitance to delete anything. Well, someone's published it at some point. We'll maybe need it one day. And having that ability to just sit back and say, when was it last refreshed? What in there am I realistically going to need? Is it live? Is anything running from it? And the answer is, it's not been refreshed in a year. Nothing live is running from it. Is there any sort of innovative development in there, proof of concept, and that I might want to have a bit of a reference to? And sometimes the answer is, no, it's not been refreshed, nothing runs off it, but actually it was quite a clever bit of innovation that we never ended up using. Take a copy of it, store it in an archive folder in a SharePoint, but don't have it published up to your service. That is where you're sort of going to clog up your capacity and confuse people. So that's the kind of behavior we'll encourage. There are so many ways to manage deployment as well. If we talk about Power BI again, so you've got, to have SharePoint folders. Do I just have multiple workspaces? Do I use deployment pipelines? Do I use GitHub? Honestly, the answers are very broad. You need to just take account for the technical expertise in your team and the appetite to sort of how often change is going to be managed, how big is your team, and how many suppliers you'll have. But the key to this really is monitoring, having a window to what is happening in your platform. I think as a Power BI person who will sometimes land and speak to Tableau people, they can feel a bit disappointed in the visibility they get. I think with Tableau, like your out of the box monitoring can be really quite advanced and you have everything you need. Whereas with Power BI, people feel often like, it's just at a workspace level. But that's okay. Power BI has got some fantastic ways to monitor your whole platform in a more custom way. So taking that time to export the data and model it and get a real insight. And capacity monitoring here is critical as well. If you have a premium capacity, you need to have the Fabric Capacity app installed, and that is your window into how people are using your platform. And this really should be your driver. This is often the starting point. So if you're seeing all of this and you're thinking, okay, I relate to all of this is an issue, where do I start? I'd honestly start with monitoring, because that is going to be your window to where the problems are and who needs your help the most. I think sometimes we can say, oh, well, finance are super important, so actually that's where we need to start. Actually, they can maybe taken up with this much of the capacity. There's an area over here that's taken up this much. Maybe we start with them, and that is going to give us the breathing space to then really facilitate what is needed. But yeah, from here I'm going to talk about principles, but anything you want to add there, Colin, before we close that off?
Yeah, so I think just on that monitoring point, so the difficulty I think we have when we speak to a lot of organizations is how do we define a business case for a governance piece of work or a governance project, or how do I get the budget signed off to have people then implement all of these changes? I think the way that not having strong governance manifests itself in people's organizations is kind of almost, it's not very tangible necessarily. That you'll suspect there's something wrong. There's lots of little symptoms of things not quite running right, getting those mismatched numbers and different reports, different versions, get a lack of lineage and visibility of what's going on in the organization. And I think that monitoring piece that Megan touched on, there's a really quick way of sort of reaching out to someone like Reframe, where we have like that pre-built out of the box monitoring tool where we can come and deploy it. And it's not until you see in numbers all of this stuff that exists on your tenant that you then go, okay, I can understand the scale of the issue here and the amount of work that needs to kind of be undertaken. And that's often a very sort of short piece of work to kind of bring that all to life. And once you've been able to do that, then I think from there the conversations become a lot more easy, and you can actually then focus, really drill down into the specific problem points that you have.
Yeah, absolutely. So we threw a lot at you there in terms of where to start. And I think I just want to kind of round this section off with talking about the key principles. So with all of these subjects, there will be an opinion on the right way to set your workspaces up and the right development standards. And I'm always going to come back to how do you balance controls with innovation. And my advice would be if every decision you make is grounded in these four principles, you're not going to stray too far wrong. And there is always going to be a reason why we have to deviate from best practice, the industry standard. But if you ask yourself, is this decision going to maintain one version of the truth in the long term? As in, it's not going to cause duplicates, I'm not bending the truth. Is it going to keep my data secure? It's not going to prevent data breaches, it's going to keep my data where I want it to be. Is it going to reduce the overhead? Is this change that I'm making, this really quirky requirement I'm delivering, is it going to make my BI team's life easy? And this is something that in 6 months' time, when they come back to, it's easy to pick back up and maintain. And lastly, really the most important, are people happy? We can talk as data people all day long about the best way to do something, but do the end users get value? Can they do their job? And this is where we really need to focus on a people-first approach, not just the people in your team and how they're going to use Power BI and their skill sets, but what is the end goal? What are people trying to do? What questions do they have? And what are they going to do with the answers? Not just, I need to know this number. What are you going to do when that number's bad? What are you going to do when that number's good? And that is the crux of making all of this come to life. And happy to talk a little bit more, I think, in the next slide about a real life case study for us. We'll just run over a wee bit on time, so maybe another 5 minutes. But yeah, anything you want to add there, I guess, Colin, in the principal side of things?
No, well, I think similar to some of the past webinars that we've done, I think that people focus has kind of come as a common theme, and it's all around like, what are our people wanting to do? How do they want to do that, and how do we make it easy for those people? And I think, yeah, as long as we've got that kind of common theme in mind, I think that you won't go too far wrong.
Great, absolutely. So we're just going to close off talking about a case study of ours from a recent client that we're still working with, which is great. And it's a global insurance group who had, I guess, undefined ownership of their BI platform. And this had led to, over time, hundreds of workspaces, thousands of assets. And so they knew that a cleanup was necessary, but it was also a bit like, what harm is it really doing? We know there's a lot out there and it's hard to find things, but what's the actual concrete impact? Is it the end of the world? But they knew that they wanted to empower their team. They wanted to drive adoption, and so this was really the brief. How do we empower our central team to clean up our platform, to own it, to really get the most out of our data? They had been trying to launch some self-service data sets that the whole business could sort of plug into and use, but this was often hitting blockers, and so they'd had a few attempts, but nothing yet had gone into production. I think that the version control was just all over the place, and a real lack of collaboration across just different teams. So while the central team collaborated very well, they knew there were so many pockets of BI happening outside that they weren't really getting to tap into. So this is where our BI governance framework comes in. So we invested quite heavily last summer into a governance framework in which we conducted a number of research projects across all of that roadmap that I showed you earlier. This has then allowed us to have a lot of collateral so that we don't have to land and sort of figure things out. We have it all there, and we can land and very quickly identify critical areas that need remediating and accelerate your path to what good looks like, your target state. So we immediately scanned and found from the tenant settings review some critical issues that needed addressing. We were able to identify how we were going to clean up the platform. We then supported a group-wide community launch, and this was so fun. So this was where it's as simple as setting up a Teams channel and developing some material and collateral that we were able to drop into that Teams channel as a knowledge forum, but then really bring this to life with a monthly call, monthly demos that we worked on. We took on some advanced training for the internal teams where we went right under the iceberg of Power BI and talked about advanced modelling. We then brought in one of our expert Reframe BI engineers who was able to accelerate the delivery of 2 self-service models. And this was an insurance client, so it was a premium data set and a financial data set. And that was quite a complex modelling task, it's fair to say. Lots of currency involved, lots of conflicting requirements, it's fair to say, because it's self-service, right? So we've got a lot of people we're trying to keep happy. And our custom change management framework was delivered. So this was a slightly longer implementation of BI governance for us because it is such a broad company and they had real ambition to drive this forward. So often with the BI governance framework, it can be as simple as us landing and taking you through in 6 weeks. Here are the issues. Here's exactly what you need to do to fix them. Here's our opinion. We'll give you the monitoring. We'll give you some of the fixes, but from here, we'll leave you to drive that. This client really wanted us to be a part of that long-term rollout. And so the end result, I guess I'm really happy to say, is that we have drastically cleaned up the platform. Group-owned workspaces were over 50 when I started in January, and we now have just 6 strategic workspaces that we manage. The assets have been streamlined by over 50%, with a roadmap defined to streamline that even further. So those touch points, I'd say in the past, where we would have our upstream platform, we would have our own schema, we would then have a data flow. A data set had a lot of Power Query in it, had a lot of DAX in it. There would then be a second data set with calculated tables before we hit our report. We have a roadmap in place on how exactly we're going to strip that right back. So 50% reduction so far, but I think that's going to come down even more in the last few months of the year. The community, I'm happy to say, is still thriving with very little, attention from me. I think eventually the community just really takes care of itself. We'll often see questions posted from users across the business, and other users will be the ones that answer them, which is fantastic. The data sets that we developed have been rolled out to reduce reliance on the central team for very basic data requests. And I'm happy to say as well, we also have a pipeline admin role that we defined. And so that role is able to empower some of the central team to manage deployment, manage version control, and really hold the pen on QA of strategic assets. So yeah, it was a really great case study. Happy to see this come to life. And they're going to they're taking this quite seriously, and we'll have a dedicated owner of Power BI governance moving forward to really bring this to life and make sure that it's up to date with each new release. So yeah, any questions?
We've not had any questions come in yet, Megan.
No problem.
So we can skip to the next slide. So yeah, that brings the content for this week to an end. Like I said earlier in the call, next week we have our final webinar of our BI Analytics series, and that's around BI migration, where we'll be talking around the scenarios where you might have you might feel as though you've outgrown your existing BI tool, and then we'll look at how we identify what information to move and how to do it successfully. So hopefully you found that helpful. Thank you all for spending time with us today at this lunchtime, and hopefully we'll see you next week.
Brilliant. Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.